also talked there.
Oh,
but it was, I think, harder to make sure the audience could actually hear and all of this stuff. So this is a very nice setup.
It's too bad it's not bigger, but...
Yeah, you imagine, I mean, given the day it is, and like this is a great crowd, I imagine that you often are reaching capacity.
Yeah, you know, it's just, we've had I think the most we ever had was 170, which we can't do in here. We broadcast it out in the auditorium, in the lobby. The least we've ever had was two, and that was my wife and I. So, you know, which you hate it for the speaker's sake when nobody shows up.
Yeah.
But then since we've, I don't know, three or 4 years, we've been recording them. We put them on YouTube, and that's really, so even if nobody is here, you know that other people are going to see it. Right? It's a very organized stage. So that's a great thing. Now, is the exhibit still in Missoula?
It is.
Okay. And how long is it going to be there?
Until the end of April.
Okay. And are you going to talk about that? Or?
Yes,
okay.
I am.
Okay. And I won't do that.
Yeah, no, I've designed the way I'm presenting to be about the exhibit, but the idea so that you don't have to go in order to get, to get the takeaway, but I'm sure plenty of people, if they are passing through, might still be interested.
Yeah, we're going to Missoula between now and then, but maybe that'll give us an excuse.
Right, yeah.
But not on a day like today.
No, not if you don't have to do it. Right, there'll be plenty of other clearer days, exactly.
Now, are your parents in here?
They are, yeah. They're the cold-looking people kind of in the middle of that. Yeah. I think my dad, who's an LA native, has never been in anything below 19. So he's miserable.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah. The rest of my parents came in the winter. What even cold? It was like in the 20s, and my dad wouldn't leave the house.
Where did they come from?
Texas.
Okay.
So it was like the last time we were here, we finally made go do something.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Well, are you ready?
I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirby Lambert, and we very much appreciate you being here. I know you'd probably rather be out sitting in a lawn chair someplace enjoying the weather, but I think this is a great way to talk about outdoor recreation without actually having to freeze while you're in the process. So we appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate our speaker, Dr. Rachael Gross, being here. She and her group drove over this morning from Missoula, so no small effort on their part. Rachael is a postdoctoral teaching, research, and mentoring fellow at the Davidson Honors College at the University of Montana, where she teaches U.S. environmental and consumer culture history. She completed her PhD in the U.S. History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017. The Smithsonian Institute, the Lemelson Center, the Hagley Museum and Library, and the Mellon Foundation have supported her work on the history of outdoor clothing and gear. She is completing a manuscript on the history of outdoor industry from, quote, buckskin to Gore-Tex, and her public history work includes a museum exhibit on outdoor gear stories from the Treasure State, which she will be telling us about in more detail. And she's also accompanied today by her parents, who are here visiting from Los Angeles. So there they are. And I think they came just because they knew the weather would be nicer here than it is in LA. And she has two students with her whom she will introduce, Morgan and Natalie. So thank you very much for being here.
Great, thank you. How's the sound in the back for all of you over there? It's okay? Good. I'm very happy to be here and delighted to have this audience braving the cold, all in the appropriate gear, I imagine. That's actually necessary. It's not just for fashion, I know in your case. So. There's no escape to nature that's complete without a trip to the store. Or so believe millions of Americans who go back to nature every year, beginning in the late 19th century and stretching all the way to 2019. The exhibit project that my students and I are here to talk about, a historical exhibit on outdoor clothing and gear at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, illustrates this intertwining of outdoor recreation and consumption. So today you'll hear a bit about the exhibit, but don't worry, we'll be making larger arguments and telling stories that mean you don't actually have to have seen the exhibit or need to go there, though of course we'd be delighted if you made it to Missoula by April. The end of April is when that exhibit closes. In 2018, Spending on outdoor recreation in Montana generated many billions of dollars, more than $7 billion, as you can see from the number on the right. And a vast majority of Montanans participated in outdoor recreation in some form last year. Other Western states boast similar kinds of numbers, so this is not unusual. By some estimates, the outdoor recreation economy tops even consumer spending on pharmaceuticals. So you can see the orange bar, it says $887 billion for 2017, according to the Outdoor Industry Association. Admittedly, that is the lobbying arm of the outdoor industry, but nonetheless, what they're trying to portray here is that the influence of the outdoor industry is quite broad and has a vast impact on not just Western states, but across the nation. I could paint the ubiquity of the outdoor industry in another way, though. 100 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to go to an office job or even attend an academic talk at a historical society wearing outdoor gear of any kind. But outdoor companies revolutionized how Americans dressed in the 20th century, and now many of you likely own fleeces from Patagonia or the North Face that will never summit a mountain. Now, an audience here in Helena actually is more likely to go up a mountain than most of the other ones I talk to, but you understand my drift in terms of seeing outdoor clothing on city sidewalks just as much as you might on a mountain trail. But I could start this talk another way too, with stories about objects rather than just using economic data. To the casual viewer, there's nothing really remarkable about this orange backpack. And this is Julie Cull's old pack. Indeed, the mildewing and faded orange material elicits more repulsion if you were standing near it because of the smell than any kind of more deeper interest. But when I take it out of its plastic storage bag, where Cull had carefully placed it in order to preserve the bag, the pack actually yields unexpected stories. This is a Clutterworks pack, designed and manufactured in Bozeman, Montana in 1979. It has an internal frame, a mix of Cordura on the outside, as well as nylon on the inside, and it has this nice three-color design, the orange, green, and brown. Cull is an experienced outdoorswoman, and she bought the pack when she moved to Montana, specifically Bozeman, in 1979. She worked on the same block as the pack designer, Dana Gleason. Over the years, the pack served her on many adventures, and she eventually had the design of this experimental model modified to better fit her body. The Clutterworks brand disappeared, and Dana Gleason went on to form Dana Designs. Now he's in the fourth iteration of that kind of work with Mystery Ranch, also a Bozeman-based company. These early packs, like Cull's, were coveted treasures in the 1980s, and even more so in the 21st century. The company built a kind of cult following because of their reputation for rugged equipment. Our exhibit, Outdoor Gear Stories from the Treasure State, explores the history of seemingly mundane objects like this one. This pack is the way into the personal history of an experienced rock climber and mountaineer and her decades of participation in outdoor sports in Montana. The Clutterworks pack, saved long past its use on the trail, is a window for Cull, as well as it is for many of us, into her years as a climber and skier. The history of this one pack is also the story of the growth of the outdoor recreation economy in the West and in Montana specifically. In the 21st century, as many of you might know, government officials and outdoor industry lobbyists have dedicated themselves to articulating the impact of the outdoor industry on the broader state and national economy. The governor created the Office of Outdoor Recreation within the last 2 years, part of the Division of Economic Development, to promote what they call the growth of the industry with a focus on advocacy, policy, and building new business opportunities. So Montana, like many Western states, including Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Utah, now have state offices that are specifically focused on outdoor recreation and the outdoor recreation economy. It's because of offices like this one, as well as the national lobbying arm that I mentioned earlier, that we have economic data like the $887 billion that I just mentioned. But the point of this exhibit that we've worked on is not to quantify the impact of outdoor recreation. Instead, it's to trace how people draw meaning from their leisure activities, right? The reason you care so much about outdoor gear to come out on a day like this, to learn about its history. How did the desire to recreate outdoors shape people's desire to live in this state? How did Montanans like Julie Cull, like many of you, attach meaning to their outdoor recreation experiences? Those are the questions that we were hoping to address when we began this collection of stories and objects in the last year. We wondered, how can material objects help us understand the development of the outdoor recreation economy, now one of the biggest industries in Montana? The object history of the Clutterworks pack, owned by Missoulian Julie Cull since she purchased it in 1979, as well as the many other object stories that you'll hear about, shows how we can ask new questions about the evolution of outdoor recreation in this state when we pay attention to outdoor clothing and equipment as a part of the broader tourism industry. So today I'll begin by sharing a little bit more about Julie Call and her pack, that history. I'll move on to the story of DIY or do-it-yourself sewing kits using 2 other research subjects that we talked to over the last year. And then you'll hear from 2 of the students who worked on this research for more than a year, Natalie and Maddie, who will share stories from about a Trapper Nelson packboard, a Whisperlight stove, as well as a range of climbing gear. I'll finish by reflecting a bit on the process of putting the exhibit together and share with you some of the broader insights I think we can all take away from looking at these outdoor gear histories. Julie Call was interested in the outdoors since her childhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She camped with her family in northern Wisconsin and hiked the Kettle Moraine Trail near Milwaukee. She was a Girl Scout and acquired some of her earliest outdoor equipment when she was preparing for a Girl Scouting camp in her childhood. In 1965, her mother brought her the requisite knife, which cost $13. Her mother said to her, "You better not lose that knife because that's $13 that we don't really have." So Julie, who's now in her 60s, told me that she still likes to bring it up to her mother. "Yes, I kept that knife. I've held on to it all these years." Despite her attachment to the Girl Scout knife, it was actually Boy Scouting that attracted her much more than Girl Scouting. She thought that Girl Scouts magazine wasn't really interesting because, as the oldest of many children, she already knew how to cook and clean and didn't need any magazine to tell her how to do all that work. Instead, she was interested in the publication from the Boy Scouts of America, Boy's Life, because that was showing all the fun that boys got to have for the most part, according to her interview. So in the early 1960s, she recalled, she read an article. She doesn't remember the title exactly, but the impact that it had on her was unquestionable. The Boy's Life article made her want to go live in the mountains, she said. She thinks it had the same impact on many other people across the United States as well. "From the time I was 13, I knew Montana was where I was meant to be," she said. She just had to figure out how to get here. It took her many years before she traded in the hills of the glacial moraine for the mountains of the West, but that did, in fact, happen. Call moved to Bozeman from Milwaukee in 1979 with her kids and her now ex-husband when she was 30 years old. Her husband was attending school in Bozeman, and she began work at the Old World Deli on Main Street. Her years of hiking, climbing, and mountaineering were only just beginning. Though she brought a few items, like that Girl Scout knife, with her from Milwaukee, she acquired most of her climbing gear when she moved to Bozeman. And that included things like her gaiters, which were Forest Service-issued gaiters that she got from a friend who had gotten them as a part of their job in the Forest Service but no longer needed them. The Clutterworks pack that you saw an image of was also part of that first year in Bozeman. Next door to the deli where she worked was Dana Gleason's sewing shop where he made many of the backpacks. She and her family moved to Laramie, Wyoming in the winter of 1980, and she worked in a climbing shop there for 1 season. This was around the same time that specialty outdoor shops were opening all around the western United States. Some of the hubs of innovation that you might have heard about, where companies with names you might recognize include places like Seattle, Portland, Boulder, and the Bay Area. Montana, with its smaller population centers, is not usually on that list of famous outdoor companies, but cities like Helena, Bozeman, and Missoula did have new outdoor retailers, that some of which still exist today, that helped to spread the new outdoor gear all across the state. Examining the history of objects reveals values, knowledge, and the tastes of late 1970s American history. So there you can see on the left side of the screen, the orange pack is Julie Call's Clutterworks pack, alongside various other ones beginning in the 1940s with the Trapper Nelson packboards on the top, to a Kelty design later on in the 1970s. The design of the Clutterworks pack was similar to other ones in some ways from that era. The origin of the internal pack frame is contested. Some say it's Kelty, others say it's Adventure 16, a Southern California company. Most outdoor industry aficionados agree that the 1970s saw a radical shift in the design of packs. Internal frame packs allowed people to carry more weight more comfortably across longer distances. The pack's colors, though they're somewhat faded now, it really does look like that kind of dull orange, were reflected of predominant tastes of the era. If you see the muted natural tones, rust, mustard, forest green, and yellow, that dominated outdoor styles, you'll notice that that was really a question of taste, not necessity, when you compare it to the bright, I would say sometimes garish colors of the 1980s. So you can really tell if you're flipping through old outdoor catalogs, the shift from the natural colors of the 70s to the magentas and neons of the 1980s. Though Call and others around her coveted this pack as a relatively rare design, the object itself tells another story about the effectiveness of this kind of object. The experimental design was actually a failure, at least it was for her. It just didn't work, she said, because when you put the straps on, they cut into your hips and really were uncomfortable. They didn't work for her body at all. It was an innovative pack in other ways. The design was innovative because it had those additional pockets on the two sides, so it held 60 liters plus what you could add to the sides of the pack. And she could even strap an extra one of those to the front if she needed more storage space. She thought it was useful because she could finally take a pack like this skiing, which didn't work with the aluminum frame packs like the one you see in the center, because that wouldn't work on the ski slopes. The center of the pack had a supportive foam roll. That's what formed the internal frame padding, and it made it pretty lightweight, and so in that way it did make sense for her. But eventually, those waist straps became a sticking point, and she sent the pack back to the company, where she got it redesigned, now by Dana Designs, into something that actually did work for her with a buckle strap on the waist. Julie Cull eventually stopped using this pack, but she kept it for years afterward. And this is something that the students and I were hoping to find, and did in fact find when we interviewed Montana residents about their outdoor gear pasts. All over the state, people have garages or attics or basements full of outdoor gear that they no longer use, but simply can't bear to let go. And maybe some of you are recognizing that kind of habit in yourself. I'm seeing some nods in the audience. And that meant basically a treasure trove for all of us to talk through the objects and people's stories that they attach to them. In many ways, then, Julie Cull is not so different from many of you in the audience in keeping outdoor equipment well past its useful end. Sally Wright, another Missoula outdoorswoman who we interviewed for the outdoor gear exhibit, kept this sleeping pad. It's the Jerry sleeping pad you see just in the middle of the screen right there. It's pretty big. It's about this wide and rolled up. I would say this is about how tall it is. So essentially, it's as big as many of the packs you now carry. Long after it had been superseded by lighter and more compact designs, she couldn't bear to get rid of this sleeping pad because it reminded her of the very first camping trip she took with her husband. That was to the Grand Canyon in the 1960s, and it was a miserable time because her feet went over the edge of the old pad that she had. So they immediately went to the store and got her a better sleeping pad so that she could be comfortable and would indeed agree to go camping again. That's that sleeping pad from the 1960s that she's still holding on to today. You'll hear also about Richard Bridges from Maddie in a few minutes, who's a climber in Missoula who saved his old climbing equipment, much of which he made himself. He knew that it was worn out enough not to pass it on to someone else to use because that would have been dangerous, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. Likewise, you'll hear about Mike Fredrickson, another Missoula outdoorsman who held on to his old gear, and you'll hear about the stories behind that. Like the other object stories that you'll hear about today, the story of Cull and her pack show how Montanans often attach much broader meanings to outdoor gear than just a change in technology. So I'll begin then with Christy Dubois and a story about her DIY kits. Christy Dubois' story offers insights not just into family dynamics, so what worked in terms of gear in the family home, but also into the broader history of a little remembered trend in outdoor recreation history, that is DIY or do-it-yourself sewing kits. How many of you in the audience know about Frostline kits or remember those? Okay, a fair number, I would say almost half, which is impressive. I took some people through the exhibit last week, and all of them were young enough to never have heard of Frostline at all. So it was a brief trend in the 1970s, and it mostly disappeared by the early 80s, but it's a beloved set of gear for those who do remember that era. Christy was a self-described weirdo as a kid. Her Midwestern upbringing, unlike Julie Cull's, was not outdoorsy at all. She was a senior in high school before she even went tent camping for the first time. In her first years in college, she joined a canoe club, and later she tried to join an outdoor club, though it was pretty expensive for her. So she learned mostly from friends about biking, canoe camping, and what kind of gear she might need for those kinds of activities. Dubois recalled that she knew so little about outdoor recreation that she didn't know what gear to acquire for the most part. She had little specialty gear. All her clothes were cotton, she recalled, and she was always cold. This wasn't just when she was camping. This was just walking down State Street near the campus in Madison, thinking that the wind was going to blow right through her. The cold winter winds were something against the coat that she had at the time. The inadequacy of the little gear that she did have helped initiate her into the broader culture of outdoor recreation, though. She began saving up for a nice sleeping bag that she saw in a local outdoor store. Eventually, she had enough money to buy it, but by the time she went to the store, someone else had purchased it. So she had to take that money and buy an inferior sleeping bag that immediately was unsatisfying because she was cold all the time. So many of the stories that we collected were about people who went shopping only to find that what they bought was totally inadequate to the Montana, even summer nights that they experienced. Besides camping and canoeing, Dubois also began biking. To afford the equipment she needed, Dubois, like many other outdoors people this time, turned to Frostline, a company that sold do-it-yourself kits for 30 to 50% less than the prices they would be if you were buying them off the rack. Her interest in Frostline then was a part of this much broader national trend. People around the nation embraced the do-it-yourself sewing kits as accessible, high-end equipment. Frostline was the most popular brand, but there were more than 10 companies making kits around the country by the 1970s. Some of those include Holubar, Ultra, and even REI and EMS had their own DIY kit brands. Budget-conscious outdoors people bought these pre-cut fabrics and materials along with directions for how to put them together, and depending on their sewing abilities, could sew them either in a day or in 400 hours, right, depending on how much they knew. So essentially what you'd be purchasing is a pack like this one, and ideally you transform it into a very beautiful down vest like that one. It didn't always go so smoothly, as you will hear. Many baby boomer kit purchasers had grown up camping with their families, and when they, as young adults, sought out similar kinds of activities, this was the most accessible way to get the equipment that they needed. Many saw the increasing prices of these specialty outdoor stores around the country as increasingly inaccessible, and so this was how they got high-end equipment. DIY kits grew alongside the boom in backpacking of the 1970s, made possible in part by the boom in popular environmentalism of the same era. Owning these products and going camping, fishing, or hiking could signal things like youth, leisure, and time to make them, as well as the craft skill to actually be able to put one of these things together. The origins of DIY kits for Christy Dubois and Sally Wright, another Missoula outdoorswoman who I'll talk about, and for many other Montanans, is in this company, Frostline, that many of you have recognized. I'll give you a brief history of that and then bring you back to the story of the people who participated in this trend in Montana. For Colorado native Dale Johnson, who founded Frostline, it was easy to see the problem with backpacking gear in the middle of the 20th century. His first backpacking trip was in the summer of 1949 with some buddies before he attended the University of Colorado, and they went to the Needle Mountains. The equipment, he later recalled, was terrible. He carried a heavy surplus backpack, a cheap sleeping bag stuffed with a vegetable fiber called kapok, and jars and cans full of food for the trail. This is not unlike some of the other stories that you'll hear about, right? Carrying the cans of food all the way up a mountain. His memory of cold nights and uncomfortable days helped inspire him to create this outdoor company in the years that followed. He worked for 8 years with Jerry Cunningham of Jerry Mountain Sports in Boulder, learning both the principles of design and the notion that outdoor customers actually might want to make their own gear. So while he was commuting back and forth from Boulder to Denver for an uninspiring bank job, he would spend his time on the back of the bus sketching designs for new kits like the ones that you see up here. He set up a company in his basement on Dartmouth Avenue and called it Frostline because he thought it sounded kind of outdoors and cold weather-ish. It didn't really mean anything beyond that. And he ordered in bulk, 100 yards of cloth, 25-pound bags of down, and he spent evenings and weekend breaking down the material, cutting the patterns out that he needed, and then packaging them and sending them out to customers around Colorado and then later the country. He promised that everything you would need to put together a kit was in that bag. So that meant all the parts cut out, zippers, snaps, and the like. The cost savings were quite clear. You could make a beautiful vest like this one and even customize it with designs like you see here for, say, $49.95 for a sleeping bag, whereas an equal quality sleeping bag might cost $75 or even $95 if you were buying it ready-made. Frostline grew quickly. As soon as Johnson could quit his bank job, he did. As soon as he could move it out of his basement, he did that too. By 1967, he had 8 employees, and 10 years after starting the business, Frostline mailed 2.2 million catalogs a year. Perhaps some of them were going to your households. And he had a wide range of competitors. DIY kit advertisements, as well as the experiences that you'll hear about from people who bought these DIY kits, suggest that there was a complicated relationship and negotiation of gender roles within the family at play each time someone completed a Frostline kit. Kit companies often sold outdoor clothing and gear as an emblem of masculine craft skill, harkening back to earlier eras where that was more prominent. They directed much of their advertising at men, but for the most part, we found that most Frostline kits were actually completed by women. Men talked about making Frostline kits, but when we pressed them, it was women who were sewing for their husbands, boyfriends, sons, and family members, rather than just for themselves. Men did think of themselves as kit makers, of course, and they did often sew kits. Some people did sew them completely, but many had the help and careful supervision of someone watching just over their shoulder, telling them just what to do. Outdoor companies like Frostline then helped to reinforce this notion of men as rugged, masculine crafters of outdoor gear, even when that wasn't always reflective of the experiences that they had. So I'll tell you a bit more about some of these outdoors women who we talked to so you can see how that played out in real time. Wisconsin native Sally Wright didn't consider herself an outdoors woman at all when she met Alden during graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They spent the summers in the West, even when they were in school. They were eager to escape the humidity and spend their summers camping, hiking, and fishing. Back in Wisconsin, she began by sewing spray skirts for kayaks to bring in an income. She remembered that kind of work ruined her sewing machine, but it did give her the confidence to be able to sew more gear that she needed that she couldn't find anywhere else for her family. Other women that she studied with in her graduate program recommended this company, Frostline, and it was their testimonials, as well as the price comparison with what she could find in the stores, that convinced her it was time to give the Frostline kits a try. This is an image from our exhibit, and it's the sleeping bag on the right, so in the middle of the screen, that blue one, that Sally Wright sewed in 1969. That was the first of many Frostline kits that she acquired and then sewed. She would work on the dining room table, laying out all the pieces across the table, including the bags of down feathers. She was already an experienced sewer, so she could follow the directions and found them pretty easy, in fact. She was happy enough with that blue sleeping bag that she soon acquired another kit and sewed one for her father-in-law, and then later made kits for many of her family members. She could make quick work of the kits, sewing a vest in a day or at least a weekend, because she remembered she also had to be the one to put lunch on the table for the family. Even with her tendency to reverse directions because of dyslexia, she found the directions easy to use as well. She recalled that later in life, she could afford more than just the DIY kits, but she still chose to purchase them because they made great gifts, as long as they were already sewn, for all of her outdoorsy family members. A Frostline kit ad from 1977 claimed that anyone should be able to make a kit. But both the advertisements, like you see up here, and people's experiences suggest that that wasn't always the case. This full-page advertisement suggests that Jake, the man in the picture, normally doesn't have the skill to put together kids' toys. So the caption up there, in case you can't read it, saying, "We never buy toys that require assembly because there's no way he could do it." But according to this, he's doing just fine with the Frostline kit. It doesn't seem that way from the image, though, because he still has a stern and disapproving woman, presumably his wife, looking over his shoulder, checking on what kind of stitching he's doing just at the sewing machine. Her skepticism suggests that men didn't quite have the mastery that they would like to think of this kind of craft skill, and the stories we heard from people suggest that this advertisement wasn't far off. Another interview subject that we talked to, who was married to Christy Dubois, is Bert Lindlar. He grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and had the dream of being an outdoor writer. He recalls skipping school every time an outdoor magazine like Field and Stream came in the mail so that he could read it cover to cover. He made only one Frostline kit. It's pictured at the bottom here. It's that dark navy coat at the bottom. Early in his career, before he had the money to buy ready-to-wear clothing. A friend helped him sew what he called the most difficult of all the Frostline kits, and that was the down coat. But he had no sewing skills at all, but he saw these kits as top quality, so he really wanted to make one. He spent a lot of time at the home of his friend, Marion Stratton. Marion walked him through the process, and, as he recalls, likely helped him with the hardest parts. Lindlar later explains that he never would have made the parka without her help, and that he never sewed again. He still thinks of himself as the one who made this kit. He's very proud of it, and he only wanted to loan it to the exhibit, not donate it, because he wanted to make sure this stayed in his personal collection. The use of DIY sewing kits for boys in home economics classes echoes this same kind of story about different ideas about gendered labor. Administrators were often on the lookout for assignments that would make sense for boys as well as girls for these home ec classes in the 1970s. The Frostline founder, Dale Johnson, had the idea that they should start teaching what he called bachelor survival, where essentially the boys would learn how to cook, learn how to sew, and in learning how to sew, they should make Frostline vests. What else? By the end of the 70s, he was quite successful. Over 2,000 schools offered what he called bachelor survival courses and used his company's kits to sew in the classroom. Sally Wright's sons in Missoula, Montana, sewed these very kits as a part of their junior high experiences. She was an avid sewer who always protected her sewing machine, or so she thought. She told her boys, don't touch, anytime they tried to come near the sewing machine. But when it came time to sew the vest, it turns out they knew exactly how to operate the machine. She guesses that they were probably trying it out because they were so intrigued by all the work she was doing on other outdoor gear around the same time. Now, these boys didn't become lifelong sewers, perhaps like the Frostline founder would have hoped. Just like Bert Lindlar, they never sewed another stitch again. All right, so back to the story of Christy Dubois, who was also a Frostline kit maker. In 73 or 74, Dubois made a Frostline kit of bike panniers. Like Call and like other people, she retrofitted them to suit her needs. So that meant that she used the original kit, and you can see, even though it's a little bit blurry, this is the little Frostline logo or tag that people sewed on, and they could write in by hand, this Frostline kit was made by, and then it says Christy Dubois right on the label right there. Many of the kits have that kind of material. But she customized it to suit her needs because eventually, she's still using these panniers today. She needed reflectors, so she added those on, as well as new hooks to hook them onto her bike rack. But they worked from the 1970s through 2018 when I last talked to her about these, so they're a pretty impressive set of outdoor gear. The Frostline trend stayed with Dubois when she moved to Bozeman in 1976. She didn't have a parka appropriate for the mountains. Remember, this was the person who was always cold in Wisconsin, no matter what she was wearing. So she bought a Frostline kit. She had a treadle sewing machine at a garage sale for $35, and she sewed this green and orange Frostline mountain parka. She considered herself, what she said, only a half-assed handy person. She'd taken sewing in junior high, but never really sewed anything like this, but it seemed worth it because it was high-end gear that she needed. This jacket, though, was not exactly what she needed. As soon as she finished it, she realized it wasn't really waterproof, it wasn't really windproof, and it wasn't really going to keep her warm climbing up mountains near Bozeman, Montana. Nonetheless, this was all she had, and so this jacket served her for many years of outdoor adventures. She wasn't sure if she still had the jacket when we first talked, but she had used it for gardening a fair amount in the last decade, and she dug it up from her basement so that we could put it on display in our exhibit. So she was pretty pleased that she came across that. She was less concerned, this is Christy, about who was doing the work of sewing Frostline kits in the home, and very much concerned about finding gear that would actually fit her body. She's just over 5 feet tall and was quite small, and so she always had trouble finding gear that was appropriate for her size. That meant she was constantly modifying things like these gaiters right here by cutting them off and then re-sewing them so that they would fit her much shorter legs. She had a problem not just with the gaiters, but with packs. She had trouble affording buying fancy packs that were better fit for her body, and sometimes they weren't accessible at all. So she remembers she would learn from Girl Scout leader friends or from other outdoors women what types of packs were better for her body, but over and over again, she was just uncomfortable with packs that were fitting badly on her back and that really left her with pinched legs, pinched hips, or cut off circulation. So this is a model from our a mannequin from our outdoor exhibit. That's a compilation of different types of gear. So you can see Army surplus pants harkening back to that earlier era post-World War II. The Forest Service gaiters that I mentioned are sort of visible in the bottom in forest green. And then a Frostline jacket on top of what I love, those rainbow suspenders, which I'm trying to bring back in style. It hasn't worked so far, though. Christy recalled that she eventually bought a JanSport backpack that was meant for a small person, a small adult, and she used that for a number of years. But eventually she was in agony again on a backpacking trip, and she really was looking for something else. And so, along with her husband, Bert, she went straight from the trailhead, she said, to the REI in Salt Lake City and tried on backpacks and her husband found one just for her. Like many of the other people, like Sally Wright and her sleeping pad, it was from a bad experience on the trail that she went back to the outdoor store, right? Back to the boulevard to figure out what she needed in order to have a better outdoor experience. The decline of DIY kits in the 1980s happened for a number of different reasons. One is because American companies started moving production overseas, and so eventually you could buy vests or sleeping bags for the same price ready-made as it would cost to buy a Frostline kit. So for that reason, they stopped making sense. But there was another reason, too. A former marketing manager for a kit company, Holubar, suggested by the 1980s that any man who expected his wife to sew a kit for him was roadkill. It was because of the wild success of the women's liberation movement, he said, that piles of unsewn kits still sit in attics around the country. Ultimately, though, I think DIY kits stopped being worth it because high tech overtook DIY. Whether it was a man or a woman sewing the vest, regardless of their skill level, this was still something that happened at home and was more amateurish. With the introduction of new high-tech materials, Gore-Tex included, it wasn't possible to have these kits seem like evidence of craft skill alone. They might seem downright dangerous if they couldn't do the job. As one former gear company owner asked, "Do you really want to climb Denali with a tent you sewed yourself?" Companies like Frostline then started to seem dated and behind the times because customers who sewed these kits at home couldn't really do Gore-Tex in the same way. Though the trend was short-lived, baby boomers around the country still proudly use their Frostline kits they sewed for themselves and their families in the 1970s. This is Sally Wright showing off the seam of her sleeping bag that still works and still is in use in her household from that era. She remains impressed with how they held up after 5 decades of use. Of course, as someone who doesn't sew at all, I'm impressed that she sewed this kit that has remained intact after 5 decades of use. Here's an image of Christy, both from when originally she sewed her jacket and then now in the exhibit when she was showing it off more recently. Visitors to the exhibit confirmed that many do have their Frostline kits and they're still using them, which I think once again is evidence of how you can get these material objects up on display, and that's an entry into broader stories people have about the meaning outdoor recreation and the outdoor goods have in their lives. So now I'm going to invite up my students one by one to talk about some of the other objects in the exhibit. So you'll hear from first Natalie and then Maddie about their work on the project, how they participated, and then favorite objects of theirs that also have broader stories attached to them. All right, so Natalie, you're up first.
Hello. As Rachel introduced, my name is Natalie Maggio, and I'm a student at the University of Montana studying history education with a minor in wilderness studies. I first got involved with this project a year ago when I took Rachel's environmental history course, and she was just getting started on this project and introduced that she was looking for student researchers, which I joined the project from there. As part of my contribution, I helped collect oral histories, organize the exhibit, helped take pictures and organize some of the gear at different conferences, and have been helping share a little bit of my experience at opportunities like this one to speak to all of you. So one of my most prominent interviews that I did was with a local Missoulian, Duan Hampton, who's actually Rachel's neighbor. Hamp was an incredible person to talk to. He was so passionate about his experiences hiking and skiing throughout his life. It was really interesting to see just how many of one person's environmental values were tied up in this gear, which is then tied up in all these stories. One in particular, he talked about his 1960s Trapper Nelson packboard, which is the red, smaller packboard up in the right-hand corner of the screen. He recalls the packboard as, and I quote, a magnificent packboard, despite what we would probably see as very small and uncomfortable today. He recalls carrying up to 50 or 60 pounds of weight on this tiny wooden packboard, a feat that just seems ridiculous to me today, who struggled with my much fancier packs later on. After hearing him talk about all the emotion tied up in this one packboard, it was really fascinating to then be able to see and handle it and just have a visual representation of all these stories of backpacking in Colorado and Montana that he had with it. Another particularly interesting object in this exhibit is this 1980s Whisper Light stove, which was donated by Mike Fredrickson. In his interview, Fredrickson shared some of the personal stories that he has associated with his stove, such as the use of it on a 60-mile backpacking trip for his 60th birthday in 2005. So not only was that an incredible time, but Fredrickson also explained why he was still using this stove almost 20 years later. Earlier in his life, the Whisper Light design proved invaluable during a backcountry ski trip when his friends' newer and fancier stoves tended to freeze since they weren't using white gas. So in that experience of sub-zero temperatures, in the backcountry skiing, having a stove that worked was kind of important. So today, if you're familiar with Whisper Light stoves today, you'll notice that the design has changed very little since the 1980s. So clearly, Fredrickson's personal experiences with the reliability of the stove's design is consistent with the continued popularity of the Whisper Light stove today. So throughout this project, I have been constantly inspired and surprised by how complicated the history is. I've always had a passion for history because of how personal it can be, and which is proven time and time again consistent with my research on this project. Last semester, I was able to be a part of the Wilderness and Civilization program at the university, which is an intensive field studies minor program, which involved a lot of backpacking, which was very new for me. I grew up in an outdoor family, I thought, and then I came to Montana and realized that I've never done a lot of these outdoor recreation that many local Montanans have been doing their whole lives. So my experience with this project definitely gave me a new perspective on what choices I was making in my own experiences attempting new forms of recreation. For example, I have a better appreciation for hamp traveling with that tiny wooden packboard when, with much less weight and much newer, much more comfortable pack was still a struggle for myself. Also was surprised by how this Whisper Light stove that is part of our exhibit is almost identical to the ones that I learned how to use on a 10-day backpacking trip with the program. But I've been surprised by how complicated this project can be as well. I had started this project with an idle curiosity about how gear has changed over time, but as we kept going, I kept finding more and more questions about why the gear has changed or why not it has changed. And honestly, there's not a ton of answers, though we have found quite a few. It almost seems like there's always more questions than there are answers, as much research, I would presume, goes. But nonetheless, I've been constantly inspired by just how important these stories are. An old packboard may not seem that interesting, but the stories that hamp tells about that tattered piece of canvas make it important. And a stove that hasn't changed much is a significant reflection of its value in and of itself. The history of this gear looks beyond how it changes and why those changes matter. After all, people like Hamp, Mike Fredrickson, and everyone else who contributed to this exhibit have kept their old gear for a reason.
Hi, my name is Madison Miller. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Montana studying chemistry. I moved to Missoula because I'm an avid skier, runner, paddler, rock climber, and I sought to use these activities as a means to explore a beautiful new state full of people who share my passion for the outdoors. I do my best to maximize my time on the water and in the mountains, no matter what season. Having worked in outdoor education, I've seen the transformative power of the outdoors on people of all ages. And most importantly, how distancing ourselves from the city brings people together. I personally believe that spending time outside is quintessential for the health and happiness of all people. I joined Rachael's project last December because I was personally curious about how outdoor recreation has changed in the last 100 years, and what valuable lessons I could learn from the people who had made time for outdoor recreations while still raising children and filling their days with a career in the city. Through this project, I hope to share with people of my own age that outdoor recreation is about far more than just a cool Instagram picture, but rather a culture that has shaped people's lives for the better. In the process of this exhibit, I had the chance to interview Dr. Richard Bridges. Having climbed since college, his sport had taken him all over the globe. And then here in this display case are a bunch of artifacts that we received from donors and lenders. Many of them belong to Richard, and they range from the 70s to 80s, old climbing gear from ice axes to a Great Pacific Ironworks t-shirt and even some mountaineering gear down there on the bottom. He had seen the transformation from leather to plastic climbing boots and homemade to commercially available climbing equipment. While he no longer uses a wooden handled ice axe like that one there on the very left, something about climbing gear may never change. For instance, a figure-8 belay device that Richard lent us was made by Yvon Chouinard Company in the 80s, long before it grew to become Patagonia and Black Diamond as we know them today. And this mannequin here, you can just barely see it, but hanging off the harness is the belay device entwined in the rope. This belay device is still available today. It retails for $15.95 on the Black Diamond website, and it looks pretty much the same, it's just a different color. I believe this piece of gear is an analogy for a far more important element of outdoor culture. When I asked Rich what had stayed the same over all the years he had been climbing, he said, "I think the sense of adventure has not changed. The sense of camaraderie between climbers, that hasn't changed." Here in Montana, we are lucky to live among a community of people passionate about spending time outside. And even more fortunate that our outdoor community fosters a sense of adventure and friendships in our daily lives as well as in wild places. This project showed me that people hang on to retired climbing gear and old wooden skis for a reason. They are not just physical manifestations of our adventures, but a vessel for connecting people and establishing lasting relationships. This project also showed me the importance of public history. On the opening night of the exhibit, I shared vintage climbing and skiing gear with some of my friends and classmates. We chatted with the people who shared their old equipment, and it helped me to realize how we choose to spend our free time shapes who we are. Stepping away from the office from time to time has allowed these people to become who they are today. Finding a community Finding a community to make memories with. These people shared their items, could still recall their dirt bag climber stories from when they were my age. I made the personal realization that sometimes it's okay to shut my laptop and hit the trail. When I'm older, I'll think back to my college days or remember sliding down the M Trail on an icy day in December or seeing a grizzly bear in Yellowstone, not the midterms and the late night studying. I hope this exhibit helped my friends to see that too, that the older Missoula residents who shared their stories were content with the life outside, and us young people, we should be too. Thank you.
So as you can see, I was very lucky to work with students who asked insightful questions about old outdoor gear and what else they can tell us. I'm going to walk you briefly through the process of putting together the exhibit, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm sure there are many outdoor gear experts in the room who are interested in situating their own experiences in this broader chronology, and we'd be happy to talk further about that. So the project started more than a year ago with a pop-up museum at Imagination Brewing Company in Missoula, where we invited people to come share individual objects so we could get a sense of who there was to interview in this place, as well as what kinds of objects would tell cool stories. So here are some of the people, including Mike Fredrickson on the very left, reflecting on, look how much jackets have changed or not, right? That's a Missoula style you'd still see to this day, Helen, I bet too, on display on the table. The project was a partnership with the community and represents a kind of critical interpretation with what Natalie and Maddie have pointed out is a broadly popular topic as well. As a part of my broader work teaching courses in history at the University of Montana's Davidson Honors College, I got to recruit these students and then integrate a lot of this work into the classes that I was teaching. I got funding from both the university and state institutions in order to pay for the student research and the mounting of the exhibit itself. By mid-April, most students had completed oral history interviews and transcribed them for the purposes of the project. Many public history students had read about things like the politics of public history, but also about the nitty-gritty of writing things like exhibit labels so that you could read them in an accessible manner. Here, one of those students, Jordan, talks with Sally Wright about the label that he's drafted just behind for the exhibit. Many students who are history majors were interested in working in the field of public history, and so they got to learn what kinds of audiences were they interested in and how to analyze things like material culture. So Natalie and another student, Stephen, here are cataloging the red frost-lined vest and many of the down sleeping bags we have in the display. Students in the Wilderness and Outdoor Civilization program were the content experts, really. So they were the ones who helped me expand beyond the sports that I had written about in my research project, Buckskin to Gore-Tex, to sports that I hadn't even included. So for instance, Maddie's expertise on climbing helped us put all of that display up, which I knew very little about. And so I was really thankful to have these students who were far more experienced than me. Here, Wilderness and Civilization students are discussing sustainable business practices with a guide who works for a hunting company on the right side of the screen. So you can see how they're learning not just about the history of the industry, but also present-day practices. All the students had a hand in trying out presentations with audiences large or small. Here you see Maddie in a kind of meta moment, because you just saw her talk, giving a presentation at the local public library. Through these kinds of reflections, the students learned how to connect individual objects that they collected with the broader narratives of the exhibit as a whole. Now, the outdoor gear exhibit opened just a few weeks ago. You've seen some of the images from here. Here's the whole room with one of those fancy panorama photos. We're very proud of the work we put together. But the point of the exhibit talk isn't to make you come to Missoula necessarily to see this exhibit, though we'd be delighted if you made it there. Instead, there's a broader argument to make in this exhibit project, which I think we can do even from afar. In the outreach we did for local papers and on TV, we made a case for this kind of collaborative work between the university and the community. And here I'm arguing that outdoor gear stories are a necessary part of the work we do in our advocacy. So in other words, it matters that we have the data, like the economic information, coming from state and national offices, but that only makes sense if we can situate it with the stories of local people and their beloved backpacking stoves. Those two things have to work hand in hand. Perhaps the most gratifying part of the exhibit, then, is seeing audiences connect with the objects that they see up on the wall and recognizing that they're a part of these broader histories, that their leisure time experiences are actually worthy of broader study and analysis. So here are a couple of things that people say about the exhibit before I close out. I probably can't read this handwriting, so I've just captured some of the details from it. Neat exhibit, I had to include that part because it says that it brought many memories of my earlier camping and hiking gear. I too made many Frostline kits, jackets, gaiters, booties, and sleeping bag even. The green Kelty pack is the exact model my wife and I bought in 1971 for $50, which was a lot of money for us then. I was soon buying my own fabric in order to custom design and construct my own gear. And then this person goes on to say, gear technology advances. No dad's World War II surplus chicken feather sleeping bags and sweating A-frame tents, luckily. But what remains important, here's where it gets interesting, is the preservation of our wild heritage for a future generation to mold their mind and body. So just like Maddie and Natalie suggested, many people who visit the exhibit are reflecting on how these material objects help them get at broader values that they hold related to wilderness and to public lands. Here's another one of these reflections. Been camping and hiking year-round since the 1950s, and so much of my gear is gone now, but I still have Camp Trails pack frames, a Gary tent, Eddie Bauer Karakoram down bags, and a variety of stoves, all from the 1960s. I'm still using the 1960s vest, parkas, and rain chaps that I made in that time as well. This is a nice exhibit, this person writes, and it brings back memories, even smells, from adventures around the West and Minnesota's Cutico canoe country. The gear has evolved to help us adapt to our own environment as we roamed new parts of it. One might hope there will be new kits to help us survive on a new and warmer planet. There are some personal connections in that reflection, and the broader vision that this writer brings up might not be the one that you share, but nonetheless, the way that he connected personally shows the broader value that he's attaching to even simple things like outdoor gear on an exhibit wall. I offer this final image of students as a model for how we all might begin to see ourselves in this broader history. These are students from my class who study wilderness. As they listen to the gear store owner reflect on marketing and business practices, they're also becoming students of history and learning that everything they buy or wear tells something about them and their politics, whether or not they realize it. Thank you. So we're happy to take questions. Invite Maddie and Natalie back up here. Come on, guys, in case they're experts.